Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the legal and government correspondent. Today, our special guest is State Senator Sheila Harsdorf. Welcome to the show, Sheila.
Good to be here, Jamie.
Is it all right if we're first name?
Absolutely.
We've known each other for
Absolutely.
20 years, so
Yeah.
I figured that that would be all right.
I appreciate that.
It is election season, and we've been having different candidates and incumbents on talking about their races. And so you probably don't need an introduction, but I'll just to give a little bit of the biography. You graduated from River Falls High School. Your family is in the River Falls area. You have an animal science college degree and have a background in farming. Got in the legislature in 1988. It was about the time your brother got out, isn't it?
It is, actually.
And then you ran for assembly, 5 terms there, and then took 2 years off back to farming, and then ran against Alice Clausing, and that turned out to be your closest election you've had so far. Is that right?
It was, yeah.
About like 50-47 or something like that. But other than that, I mean, once elected to the Senate, you've been reelected actually 4 times, but this is your 6th election because there was a recall in August of 2011. Okay. So you are in the Senate, so that I count that's over 20, going on 25 years experience in the legislature and looking for your 5th term in the Senate. Is that right?
That is correct.
So basically, this is a platform for telling folks and answering the question, why a 5th term? Why do you want to return to the Senate? What would you like to do?
Well, we've made some tremendous progress in the last few years in really turning our economic opportunities around in the state. Back in 2010, Wisconsin ranked in one ranking by Chief Executive Magazine the 41st friendliest state to do business in. And clearly that's nothing to be proud of. And we know it's all about creating jobs, creating an environment where where we're encouraging individuals to start their businesses, to grow their businesses here in our state. And so we've made a concerted effort to really try and increase that ranking and turn our state into a friendly business climate. I'm pleased to say that now in 2016, in that same survey, we rank number 11th. And so that is something that we know it's really about providing our citizens with opportunities for employment, opportunities to grow their business, and to better themselves economically through employment.
Okay. So what committees do you currently serve on, and do you expect to continue on those committees?
I currently serve on the Joint Finance Committee. Wisconsin is, I believe, the only state that has a single finance committee, and I've had the privilege of serving on there for a number of years, actually 3 different separate times. So my hope would be that, provided I'm reelected, that I would continue to have the opportunity to serve on the Joint Finance Committee. I also chair the Universities and Technical College Committee, and obviously higher education is a very important to our state. We've got a great UW system, a great technical college system. And I also serve on the Ag, Small Business and Tourism Committee, and I also am co-chair of Information Technologies Committee.
Okay. So that joint finance, just to be clear, it's joint between the Senate and the Assembly. And so you were on that committee when you were in the Assembly?
For a period of your time, yes.
And now you're there in the Senate?
Correct. And we have, unlike Minnesota, which has a number of finance committees based upon issue areas, we have a single finance committee made up of 8 members of each of the Assembly and 8 members of the Senate, and then 2 members from the minority party and 6 members of the majority party in each house. And so that is, and the finance committee does the bulk of the work on the budget bill, which obviously is the most important document that the legislature deals with.
And if my memory serves me, you've only served on the joint finance as part of the majority party?
Correct.
Okay. I can't imagine it could be too much fun being on there, but the minority party being outnumbered 6-2. But is there input, and do the majority listen to the minority when?
There is. At some points, it's actually been an 8-8 split. 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats when each house was controlled by a different party.
Sure.
So obviously that.
Yeah, you've been in the Senate 16 years, and part of that was under Democrat control.
Yes, I have served in the minority both in the Assembly and the Senate.
Oh, okay. It's been even longer though in the Assembly that the Republicans have controlled. Is that right? Or has it gone back?
What was that?
That the Assembly majority being Republican, it's been a longer period of time. The Senate's
I
usually
believe so.
closer. It's like,
Yeah,
because
yes.
it's 33
Yes.
seats versus the 99.
I believe you're correct, yes.
All right, so you mentioned already jobs as being one of the primary things that you're proud of your record, and so what do you see as being important to be able to continue that momentum, that rise from 41st to 11th in that survey?
One of the things that we're hearing from the business community is that we really have to focus on making sure that those looking for jobs have the skill sets that the employers need. We also know that we are going to have to attract workers into our state if we are going to meet our workforce needs. And so one of the focuses that we've been working on is really looking at how we can help people of all ages, but especially young people coming out of high school and college, how we can make sure that they have the skill sets that they need. And actually encourage them to consider what kind of a career they want to go into. That's why we've passed a legislation basically calling for career planning as young as 6th grade. But we've passed legislation and increased funding for apprenticeship programs. For example, Hudson High School has a phenomenal program where they provide high school students and they match them with employers. And obviously these programs don't work without the support from employers, but that really provides high school students the opportunity to go and work in a business to see whether they want to do something or in some cases what they don't want to do. But also, very importantly, it helps them learn the soft skills that employers are looking for.
Well, I think, with all deference to you serving on the Higher Education Committee, I happen to be on the Hudson School Board and want to see us have a strong K-12, because I think the stronger our K-12, the less reliant we will be on our higher education to be training our workers. We get more people going straight into careers if we have a strong K-12. What do you see as being avenues that we might be able to beef that up?
Well, one of the things that I totally agree, we need stronger partnerships between K-12, our technical colleges, and our university campuses, and our four-year campuses, because it is about looking at how we can address affordability, ensure success, and opportunity for students. And so it really is, we want to encourage those collaborations between those different institutions. We want to maintain, we've got, as you know, a reputation for good schools in our state at all levels, and we want to keep that. That's why I worked to increase funding for K-12 in the last budget. When the budget came to us, there was actually a proposed reduction in K-12 funding. I didn't think that was acceptable. So we were able to not only maintain the level of funding, but provide a slight increase. But as we were talking before this interview started, one of the things that's really putting pressure on every other aspect of our state budget is the funding of medical assistance. In the last budget, we put $650 million more into medical assistance, and these are the services for the most vulnerable and needy in our state. But we also, so we need to recognize that is putting pressure on other aspects of the budget, including K-12, which is actually the single largest appropriation in our state budget, as it should be. Okay.
And you had mentioned, with your focus on higher ed, just in your district, Senate district, you've got two different technical colleges. You got WITC and then Chippewa Valley that has a place in location in River Falls, and then you got the UW River Falls, and you've got UW Stout.
Absolutely, yes.
And so a big interest in those areas, but I like what you're saying about the partnerships, and our school has also looked into that because we're so close to UWRF as well as WITC.
One of the things that concerns me is when I go to a four-year campus or a two-year campus, and they share with me how much remedial education that some students need. And it's one thing; it's understandable if one has been out of in the workforce for a period of time, and you get laid off or whatever, that you might need remedial. But I think it's a concern when recent high school graduates need extensive amount of remedial education. And it's not about pointing the fingers at anybody, it's about figuring out how we can minimize that. And one of the things that the UW has done is they've provided an early math placement test where at no cost high school students can go in and take this course online and really, before they get out of high school, determine if they are deficient in any areas. And so it really helps them know what they need to learn before they finish their high school, so that they can be more prepared when they enter a 2-year or 4-year campus.
All right. Well, and you mentioned about putting more money into education, because there's different ways, and don't want to get into all the technicalities, but you've got equalization aid, and then there's categorical aid. And when a district is seen as property rich, which we have several districts in your Senate district that own lake homes, and so they're considered property rich, or you've got even Hudson School District, where we have a lot of taxable property, and so Madison views us as being property rich, and therefore we don't see, in fact, we saw a reduction in our equalization aid. Categorical aid, we did see an increase, and we appreciate that. We kind of look for that to be more of an emphasis, see that as more fair, because getting more aid per student that you have, as opposed to some formula when somebody is making the determination we're property rich. Do you see that categorical aid as something we can look at? Because things like more property tax relief is appreciated, but it doesn't go directly into the programs.
You know, and as you know, the most recent budget did put the increase in school aids into the categorical, and that was so that every district would benefit. We recognize the challenges that school districts are facing. The majority of their budget is salaries, and we want to make sure that we try and keep competitive salaries. But it's something that you know, our goal is to try and provide additional funding. There's been a lot of interest in trying to revamp the formula, and I believe that there will be continued efforts to do that. In previous years, under previous administrations as well, there's been numerous studies of K-12 school funding, the formula. It's a very complex formula, as you know.
Right.
And typically, it's very difficult, realistically, to change the formula unless you put more money in and you can hold all school districts harmless, because otherwise you would have winners and losers.
Right.
And
well, maybe one way to do that, and you alluded to it already, is kind of reducing the competition for the same tax dollar. And you mentioned medical assistance as being a big item. Some would argue that one way to have done that would have been to accept the federal aid and take less burden, take the burden off the state taxpayers. What do you say to those folks?
Well, we are one of a few states that have no gap coverage, and so we actually increased. We provided coverage actually to childless adults under our Medicaid program, and have no gap coverage. And so those, they have, if they're not on the state program, then they can go to the exchange, and those rates are all subsidized, as you know.
Okay. Another thing that's competing for the tax dollar, which is really important to jobs and attracting businesses here, is our infrastructure, having good roads and bridges. And one of the things that we tried to do was have a lockbox, if you will, having it funded by the gas tax. But because of the advent of the fuel-efficient cars, when gas went up to $4 a gallon, then gas usage went down and people were driving less. Now the price has come down to almost half, and what we've seen is that gas tax not be able to fully fund what we need. More and more road projects and bridge projects are being pushed off into the future, which is tough for safety-wise, but again, back to jobs and encouraging commerce and helping commerce. What would you propose a nickel or even a dime increase in the gas tax that would be dedicated to that, so that other portions of our budget wouldn't have to have that money taken away for roads?
So one of the things that I recognize the importance of the infrastructure, and you're exactly right, it is one of the things that businesses look at. And it's important to our residents, and it's important to businesses, it's important to tourism. And one of the things that we've seen is as you indicated, transportation revenue is flat. And so as costs continue to go up. But one of the things that we actually, I'm very pleased we were able to protect the fund, because in previous years, a number of years ago, we saw some significant raids out of the transportation fund for other things that, while they were important things, it really pulled money away from transportation. And we have a segregated transportation fund. So it's separate from the general fund that funds things like education and medical assistance.
Right.
And so as we look, I think it's important that we really work hard, look at how we can put together a long-term sustainable transportation budget. I think first we need to look at efficiencies, continue to, because our Secretary of the DOT has looked at how he can find efficiencies, and we need to continue to focus on that. And we also need to look at prioritizing projects. You know, when citizens see something that's being done as a project and they go, you know, that really didn't need to be done, they don't see it as a priority, that doesn't help. But I think we do have to look at the importance of a sustainable budget. You know, we also have to look at where we live. We are next to Minnesota, as we all know. And there we have one of the higher gas taxes right now in the state, in the country. And especially it creates a real problem, as we've seen in the past, when our gas tax is considerably higher than our neighbor to the west. And so it makes it very difficult for retailers here, especially given that people are already going to the Twin Cities. And so we want to recognize the impact that a considerably different gas tax would have here on our retailers. But it is important that we look at a sustainable transportation budget that meets our transportation needs. Obviously, we're very pleased with the work on the St. Croix crossing, which literally took an act of Congress.
Yes.
And that's something that's going to be a vital piece to our infrastructure here in western Wisconsin.
All right. Let's move on to a couple other areas that you highlight on your campaign website, which is harsdorf.com. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Okay. I wanted to be able to get that plug in. So the other area is your work for addictions. And I know that we've had Representative Knutson on here, and he has held forums here. There was one assembly person, I believe it was in particular, whose daughter was in...
Representative Nygren.
Yes, thank you. And his daughter was involved with heroin, and we had a heroin epidemic, if you will, about 7 years ago.
2013.
It was 2013, okay. And so right here in Hudson. So I think why don't you just tell us a little bit about what you think has been done so far and what more we might be able to do?
Well, it was in 2013 when Hudson, which is not a large community, lost 7 young lives to heroin overdoses. And you know, this area, our part of the state, has been hit hard, not only with heroin, but meth as well. And it was about 10 years ago, as you recall, Northwest Wisconsin was just seeing just a huge influx of meth labs in our communities. And local law enforcement came to us and asked for help. And in asking them what would be the most important thing we could do to help them as they fight this on the front lines, they asked us to introduce legislation which Oklahoma had passed a couple years prior to that, which restricts access to cold medicine with pseudoephedrine in it.
That's right, the Sudafed legislation, and you were instrumental in that as well.
I actually led the fight, and that was not an easy fight when we first introduced that, because most of the rest of the state had not, and still to some degree, have not seen a lot of meth. And so many felt it was just an infringement on citizens' ability to get cold medicine. But because of the number of people from this part of the state that came to share their stories, to testify at the hearings, I'm pleased we were able to pass it unanimously in the state Senate with all but a handful of votes in the state assembly. That legislation made an impact on the number of meth labs, but meth is still a problem, especially to the region north of here, in the northern part of the Senate district. And so when you look at heroin and meth and other illegal drugs, it really is something that we need to do what we can, not only to provide treatment opportunities, but also look at awareness, prevention. And obviously some of the bills we passed dealing with heroin really focus on saving lives, like passing the ability to have Narcan. Initially we required a prescription, now it's available without a prescription. And because Narcan is very effective in reversing a heroin overdose. We know that it's not uncommon. People they're with their friends when they're using heroin, and the first thing that they do when somebody starts ODing is to take off and leave their buddy,
right?
Because they don't want to get arrested. So we passed the Good Samaritan law that if you call 911 for someone ODing, you are immune from simple possession. And so that also is seen as helping save lives. In regards to heroin, we know that many people that are on heroin start by taking prescription drugs. And so a number of the bills that we've passed deal with prescription drugs.
I was going to ask about that because I've heard, and that was, again, big in the Hudson community, was because that's where a lot of the heroin users get their start, is on the opioids and the overprescription of painkillers. And I know that we've had some health issues in our family where we've needed, maybe some pain medicine initially, but the amount that they prescribed, we end up throwing out pills. They're rarely fully used. So what has been done in those efforts to try and stem that usage?
Well, one of the things is to make the medical profession aware of the overprescribing. I think one of the things that we're making progress on is there's that pain, that smiley face, that pain scale that they have in hospitals. And my understanding is that they are eliminating that because hospitals are basically judged or reviewed based upon how well they control pain. And so they actually, if there's too much pain, then it's a bad reflection on them and it can affect their ratings. But I think it is something that we, the other thing that we're doing is we're using the prescription drug monitoring program, and we're beefing up that website and requiring its use. One of the things we did is before we passed this legislation, pharmacists had a week to report
right.
the prescriptions that they're releasing, and we bumped that up to within 24 hours because we know that there's some people that are literally shopping different pharmacies and doctor shopping to try and feed their addiction. And so the prescription drug monitoring program is going to be a great tool not only for prescribers but also for law enforcement who are going to have to report if they find these meds at a crime scene. And so we can identify if somebody is overprescribing or if somebody is going in doctor shopping.
Well, that's why, and some of these things are conflicting policies where you want to protect patient privacy, but at the same time try to promote sharing of information that will help identify, for instance, people who are going around to different pharmacies and filling the same prescription or similar prescriptions and going to different doctors to get multiple ones for the same malady.
Right. And the other thing, I wanted to follow up on something you said earlier. If people don't finish out a prescription, flushing it down the toilet is not the proper way of disposing it. And we have, St. Croix County actually has a great prescription drug collection program where they've got frequent places where you can dispose of them properly, and then they can take them to an incinerator. But that's really important not to leave them lay around, because it's like, if you leave them lay in your medicine cabinet, it's too easy for children, for grandchildren, or friends that come to your house to take them. And all too often, we've heard the story over and over again, as you said, people who become addicted to heroin started with prescription drugs.
Then also controlling property taxes, something that, again, has been perpetual work in different areas. I know that you're quite proud of it because of the leveling off of the property taxes. Here in Hudson, we happen to be in a district that we're not affected by the revenue limits. In fact, we're the most under-levied school district in the state by almost a factor of 3. So we could levy, and I think it's almost 13 million more, about 12 and some fraction million more each year. And as a school board, we choose not to. We're in what's considered a luxurious position, I guess, compared to the majority of the districts who are bumping up against that revenue limit. What do you think about continuing to give that local control over to folks and keep it, when it comes to referendums, more and more other districts are needing to go to operating referendums just to retain their teachers or keep their class sizes where they're at. So what do you think of that part of school budgets?
Well, first of all, it's important that we control property taxes. I still, as I go door to door and travel the district, hear from people who are concerned and really point to the property tax bill that they pay compared to somebody that they might know or they previously paid in the state of Minnesota. And so I know there's continued interest and concern with controlling property taxes and not pricing a home out of the range of first-time home buyers or seniors or anyone in between. I think we've made tremendous progress in controlling property taxes. We've seen statewide. Obviously, this varies based upon local conditions and local referenda, but statewide, we've seen property taxes fall in about 6 years in a row. And prior to that, prior to 2011, we saw in that decade prior to that, property taxes went up 27%. And so we've made progress in that. As far as school funding, it's important, I believe, to always give local citizens the ability to override whatever's in place through a local referendum. But I believe, and I will continue to work for funding schools through K-12 school aids. It's one thing to go to referenda for building projects, but we shouldn't operate from one referendum to the
maybe
next.
I'm a little sensitive because I am on a school board, but I'm kind of a believer in, again, the local control, and feel that the local taxpayers are better judges over what we need rather than the bureaucrats down in Madison. So when it comes to the operating referendum, or just limits on how frequently you can go back, I think Prescott's a great example of a district that went back multiple times. New Richmond's another example, and they eventually got their building passed. But when it comes to operating, we're keeping the lights on, keeping the teachers retained, and the class sizes where they're at. Do you expect to support any kind of legislation that puts a 2-year ban on if a referendum is defeated, and would prevent from the school districts from coming back to voters to give them that decision in less than a 2-year time period?
I recognize that school districts, if they don't have their referenda on a regular scheduled election time, they pay extra for that. They have to cover the cost. So that's an additional cost. Schools are the only ones that have to go to referenda. And so I believe that they have to answer to their constituents and justify what they're proposing. And it is in the hands of voters, and it's a responsibility of voters to voice their views through the ballot box.
Okay. So we've talked about the taxes. Here's another area, speaking of taxes, the income tax reciprocity. For us who are on border districts and may have spouses who work in Minnesota, this is a very sore subject because 8-10 years ago, it was much easier to do your taxes. Now it's a lot harder, and it's costly, yes, because I'm a lawyer and I have to hire somebody to do our taxes to try and understand what portion of the income is Minnesota and what portion is Wisconsin. Do you see any progress being made to kind of go back to the good old days, or the way it was before we had this dispute with Minnesota?
Well, Jamie, this is something that there's not a week that goes by that I'm not in my district that I don't have somebody talking to me about this. This is a huge issue for our part of the state because we have so many people, and we operate as a region here. There's a state boundary there, but we operate commerce and do so many things back and forth. We should never have lost it back in 2009, and I have worked tirelessly to try and put it back into place, even though technically it is an agreement between the two governors. As you recall, in 2009 was when then Governor Plenty asked for payments earlier, like a little over $100 million. Our governor at the time said that he would pay $40 million earlier. Plenty came back and said 75, and our governor came back with 40. When the agreement fell apart in 2009, I continued to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to try and see if we could salvage the agreement. And it was late in 2009 that we had a conference call with Minnesota, and it was shortly after they got word that they had a budget shortfall. And they said, what we had put together as legislators and leadership was a fair offer, and earlier they would have taken it, but at that point in time they could not. At any rate, we lost it in 2009, the agreement. And when the new administration came back...
Yeah, because we have new governors in each state. It's different now.
But in 2011, when our new governor came into place, I worked with the Department of Revenue, and they worked very hard with the state of Minnesota to try and reinstate the agreement. In fact, they agreed to everything Minnesota was asking for in 2009. So Wisconsin agreed to everything they were asking, and it was at that point Minnesota asked for something else. And what they asked for was, when we lost reciprocity, Minnesota saw a revenue increase of about $6 million. And they wanted Wisconsin taxpayers to pick that up. And that simply, any state that has asked for that, any place in the country, it's been an agreement killer. because we would
So
be,
they're moving the target on us from
they
what
moved
was
the target. Now, since that time, I think it was maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, they said, well, we'll reduce that 6 million to 5 million. But the bottom line, it's still asking the same thing. So Minnesota actually, there's 2 legislators that are working to try and, very hard to try and create a change in their statutes that would open the door to us to begin to negotiate a new agreement. They included that provision in the tax bill, of which they didn't pass a year and a half ago, and then they did pass it this spring, but the governor vetoed it, not because of this provision, but he did veto that. And so,
so it's not over yet when you,
we're continuing to work on it. I know, and the other thing that a lot of times people don't realize is that if you have a business and you do work in both states, say you have a construction company and you have your crew go out and do a 3-hour job in Wisconsin and then they go to Minnesota and do a 5-hour job, they have to withhold based upon where those workers. So it's very cumbersome, costly, and we're going to continue to do what we can to try and get it back in place.
well, great. Well, thank you for that explanation and of where we're at on that. And unfortunately, we're done with our 30 minutes. There was still one other area I wanted to get to, but we'll have to leave it there. I want to thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you.
Be happy to come back.
Very
Thanks.
good.
Thanks, Jamie.
And thank you for joining us for another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. My guest this time, Senator Sheila Harsdorf of the 10th Senate District, correct?
Yep, correct.
Very good. And again, thank you for joining us. Watch more Western Wisconsin Journal.